You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
We get a lot of questions about what is the Mettagroup approach, or the Mettagroup method, as we like to call it, in terms of working mainly with attachment repair. And where does that fit into a context of overall meditation practice? What is the point of doing the attachment work first and then getting on to the deeper meditation practice? And the main reason why I think that it's a good order is because when you repair your attachment conditioning, what you also do is open up the possibility for exploration at a deeper level. And one of the things that you want to do in your meditation practice, of course, is pursue what is essentially an exploration. And if you're restricted in terms of your capacity to explore, it also restricts the benefit of doing a deeper meditation practice. Of course, meditation practice isn't the only conduit. You probably have heard me say before that I also think psychoanalysis is a good pathway if the deep meditation practice isn't the thing. But then that also brings us to an idea of how it is that we understand the experience of self and world. And I've always had a great affinity to the Buddhist conceptualization of self and world. In the West, we might compare that to a theological approach or a materialist approach, or the God of science. Some people like to refer it to the materialist approach. That being that everything is just determined by the physics of things, by the biology of things, that there is no spiritual dimension, and it is simply the material world that, given certain circumstances, produces this experience of life, and that the human experience is one that has evolved through evolution. Where do you land on that? Or do you think that there's another dimension that's beyond the purely material? In Theravada Buddhism, the underlying experience is the void, right? The undefined void that everything, the primordial void that everything arises out of. In the Christian, Judeo-Islamic modeling of that, God is the thing at the end of all of it. All of it is determined by God. I've never had much sense of that, and I think that that's also an interesting way of looking at it. What, over the course of your life, since you must have had these invitations from the different kinds of thought ideas that are out there, what drew you, what made sense to you, what appealed to you? I've always been quite comfortable with the materialist approach, but then in doing meditation practice, what I discovered, not so much in the Theravada method or the Hinayana practice, that if you talk about it in Hinayana versus Mahayana, or Mahayana into Vajrayana practice, in the Theravada practice, in that Hinayana practice, the materialist approach actually continued to make sense. It wasn't much sense of a sacredness, just the practicality of inventing reality. In some sense, in Western thought, of course, it's the process of symbolization. You take the experience that you have, and then you define the meaning of it. You create the symbolic meaning of the experience that you're having. Where does that land? What's that comfortable place for you? Is it on the materialist side, where it's simply the ordinary experience of the real world versus the metaphysical world that's hard to detect. PJ.
It's funny that you're talking about this today, because I have been thinking about this week a lot, and that I was not raised with any religion. My parents, one of them eschewed religion completely, and the other one was raised without religion. And so I was raised without religion, but in this North American society with the background of it, right? And because I've been involved in recovery, there's a lot of talk of, higher powers and things.
Right.
And I thought,
as you define, right?
Exactly. And so it's like, it's like as a child watching like Christian channels, and that's what was on. I would see shows about, Jesus will come in your heart. And I remember wanting Jesus to come in my heart, and then he didn't. And it was like just another disappointment, right? And thinking about, because they really encourage you to find this higher power. And it's like, I don't have this belief in God. I have the belief, that possibility, that I'm much more of a materialist completely. It's quite possible there's lots of stuff going on that we can't know, the way a fish in a fishbowl doesn't know outside of his bowl, right? Because it's just outside of his range of sensing.
Well, that's the thing about the real. How do you understand the real? How do you understand what is happening, right? I was sitting yesterday at the airport in Amsterdam and looking out. They have the best chairs, that is to say, the most comfortable chairs, are set up so that you look out at the runway. And I was thinking about this, and how much of what actually is going on at any moment do you actually know? What is the limit of your monitoring? Can you monitor all 8 billion people and all 54 billion large animals and all and trees and plants and all of that? There isn't a way to know that. We don't actually, in this human body, have the capacity to get anywhere close to being able to actually understand what's real in the sense of that. And so what we do instead, of course, is create a symbolic meaning for what is actually happening. And what is the symbolic meaning that you tend to associate to the experience that you're having? That's actually where the crux of this is, I think, and why I like the Buddhist modeling of that. Which is, you have the capacity to sense certain things, touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. And you have mind, which is the thing that focuses you on the different mind moments, the different grabs of sensing experience. You evaluate that for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter if you ever get to it? Is there time for something pleasant? And then that's compared to this perceptual database, this memory system that we have, not of what's actually happened to us, but the symbolic meaning that we've created for what happens to us. And if there's something approaching that in the database that's associated with the experience of the present moment, then we associate that meaning with that, and then we create the perception of reality, the experience that we're having, which is a representation of meaning rather than what's actually happening. And then we have the conundrum of the self-experience, right? The referential experience that is able to reflect on the meaning that we've given something. And this is one of the main differences in the way that Western psychology and Eastern meditative practices relate to it. In Western psychology, the self-experience is the thing that's deconstructed, really, the thing that's investigated. in the Eastern meditative traditions, the sense of self is considered insubstantial, right? It's something that arises momentarily, whereas in Western psychology, the self experience is actually a thing, something that is then evaluated. And so in the Mettagroup method, we really are on the side of the Eastern meditative traditions in the relationship to the experience of self. The sense of self arises in response to the symbolic meaning that we give to the experience that we're having. But that unconscious process that assigns the meaning then is made available to the conscious self-experience. Is that making sense? The capacity to sense means the object can be sensed, then there's consciousness of the sensing experience. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter if you ever get to it? Is there time for something pleasant? And then that unfixated, unsolidified, raw sensing data is compared to the perceptual database. And if there's a meaning in there, a symbolic meaning that's already been an experience that matches closely enough, then that attaches to the present moment and it rolls into our perception of what's actually happening. So the self-experience as we understand it and what's happening as we understand it is arising in the present moment based on the conditions that the present moment gives us. And part of that process then, of course, is what do we expect to have happen? What is the action that we can take in response to the meaning that we're giving? And what do we expect to happen? So it rolls open. Actually, what's really happening, what's really in front of us is all of the possibilities that we could choose in this moment. All of them, that whole range of them. But if we create a reality in the present moment, which is very limited, we would call that a limited identity of what we think is possible for us, then all of the choices, all of the possibilities that we don't believe are possible for us are discounted. And we have a tendency to grab over and over again the choices that will produce a result that we believe to be possible for us. That making sense? And often, because these processes unfold so quickly, we don't really even give consideration to the things that we don't think we can have. And the possibility of having or not having something is conditioned in that symbolic meaning that we attach. One of the reasons I think psychoanalysis is useful once you get past the attachment repair, that early material that's resolved, and the capacity to imagine a fulfilling life is available to you. A life where the apprehension, the fearfulness of what might happen falls below the capacity to actually present yourself in an authentic way. You can begin then to explore what that process of creating reality is. We might call that becoming. Really, the whole process of this is to become who you are authentically, because you already are someone. When you get into these conversations about exploration with people, what you begin to see is that many people, or most of us, have had quite a limiting impact on our capacity to explore. And we really, that self-limiting process prevents us from going hard for the stuff that would really matter to us. And what happens over time, and I think that this largely happens to us before we really have the agency to move beyond it, is the disappointment life not unfolding in the way that we wanted, or the restrictions of the family system that we grow up in, restricting our capacity to pursue the things that we want, and the resulting sadness of that. And if you grow up in a family system where you don't actually have attentive enough caregivers who are actually capable of seeing you and understanding what your capacities are and actually help you pursue them, we collect the disappointment, we collect the sadness of that not happening. And in order to begin to pursue the things that really matter to us, we would have to be able to hold the experience of that sadness. And it's actually the sadness, the experience of that sadness, that we avoid by not actually pushing in and beginning to explore deeply. Making sense so far? One of the things that I like about meditation is that the skills are simple, really. Meditation technique is generally pretty simple to understand, and that because it's simple to understand and simple to practice, it's widely available to people to be able to begin a practice. And you do the practice, and it's effective in developing the skills that you need. So if you look at the approach to attachment repair that we use, it's a three-pillar approach, different than the three-pillar approach that Dan Brown and his team developed, that is on the psychotherapy side. So you really do have these two approaches now that really work, I think, in terms of investigating and resolving attachment conditioning. In the Mettagroup method, we developed a series of meditation techniques which develop your capacity for mentalization and emotional regulation, which is necessary for being able to engage in adult level intense relationships, right? Why would you have to be able to mentalize well, and why would you have to be able to regulate emotion well in order to form resilient relationships? Because you grow up in a family system and you learn to resolve conflict in your family system based on the way that you experience people resolving conflict. In order to negotiate a relationship with somebody, you have to be able to resolve conflict within the relationship. Now, they, of course, have not grown up in your family system. They've grown up in a different family system. And so they've learned conflict resolution strategies that are in their family system. And so one of the main tasks of forming adult relationships is integrating the attachment strategy, the conflict resolution strategies that you learned in your family system with the conflict resolution strategies that somebody learned in their family system, and you bring them together. Now, some conflict resolution strategies just sort of neatly fit together, and some of them don't fit very easily together, and so there's a negotiation that has to happen. In order to negotiate conflict in a relationship, particularly when you have conflict resolution strategies that don't go together so easily, what you're going to have to do is tolerate strong emotional experiences. What happens with strong emotional experiences? Well, they shut down your cognitive mind, and you're just left with the rote conditioning that then you have to interact with. And if you can develop the capacity to regulate emotions so that you can really be in balance in very strong emotions, then you can really resolve pretty much anything in a relationship. And if you get knocked off balance and your cognitive mind shuts down and you can't co-regulate each other in those moments, then you can't resolve conflict. Relationships don't actually come apart and don't end because of conflict. All relationships have conflict. conflict, and the conflicts change over time, particularly as your exploration takes you in different directions. It's the loss of confidence that you can resolve the conflicts as they arise in the relationship. What you notice about secure functioning relationships is that there's a big confidence in being able to resolve whatever conflict arises. So you don't worry about the conflict. Conflict arises and you have the capacity to open the dialogue around them, and you're able to collaborate with each other to resolve the conflict in a way that feels like a strong win for each person in the relationship. And then those issues settle out of the relationship. And then what's available then is the support for exploration. Adult relationships really are about supporting you in your primary exploration so that you can really take the big risks that you need to take to discover what's meaningful, to create the symbolic meaning for your life, right? For what matters to you. And often what I at least in the work that I do, discover is that people's capacity for pursuing the things that really matter to them is quite limited. And as we get older, of course, the despair of not having the meaningful aspects of life fulfilling is that despair of the difficulty of life, even in the privilege that we have. It's quite astounding. I was watching some films by African filmmakers on the flight back, and it was absolutely astonishing how materially well off we are, even in the U.S., which of course spends the bulk of the money that we make on financing our debt and the military. Is that all making sense? And so the third pillar is the psychoeducation around the dynamics of secure functioning relationships. One of the things that becomes apparent if you once you recognize that you didn't grow up in a secure household is that the modeling of relationships that you learned while you were growing up in that family system is not secure functioning relationships. You're learning insecure functioning relationships or disorganized relationship functioning, and not secure functioning. In fact, often with disorganized people, they simply refuse to believe that secure functioning relationships actually exist. This comes up over and over again, which is nobody talks like that. Nobody tells you how they're feeling. Nobody tells you what they're really thinking. It would be such a disadvantage to me if I were to actually tell people what I was thinking and feeling. It just never happens. Where would I meet somebody who would actually be willing to tell me what they're thinking and feeling? Hilarious. And then what you get is this hint about how relationships tend to filter out. But actually, I think it has more to do with us and the way that we relate to the world. We create these worlds of symbolic meaning, and we inhabit them as if that's actually what's real. And the thing about that, of course, is that everybody's doing that. Everybody's living in this reality that they've made for themselves, and where you really discover and connect and get close to people as if you're actually willing to tell people how you're creating the reality that you're experiencing, and they're actually willing to tell you what reality, what symbolic meaning they're giving to what's actually happening. And in that connecting, you form a relationship that's based on what we might call real. Of course, it is the reality that the human condition allows us to create, and not in a strictly materialist sense what's happening. We really don't have much capacity to know what's happening. We know what it means to us. So there's this shift into, this is what it means to me. What does it mean to you? This is how I'm experiencing this. How are you experiencing it, so that you can come into a place of intimate communication. Secure relationships are secure because they're not easily threatened. And insecure relationships are insecure because they're easily threatened. And disorganized relationships are volatile because the main strategy for emotional regulation that disorganized people use is social isolation. So withdrawal from the relationship. So if you're in relationship to a disorganized person, the relationships constantly seem to disappear because the person disappears, often without explanation. So the idea is, can you tell somebody what actually is happening for you, and then notice whether they stick around or not? And if you can't tell somebody what's actually happening for you, what you're doing is obligating them to be in a fantasy relationship to you, because they're going to accept what you tell them as what's actually happening for you. And then they're going to build a relationship to you based on what you've told them is happening for you. And if you haven't told them what's happening for you, they're going to base a relationship on what you told them was happening. And depending on how far off what you told them was happening from what was happening for you will be the degree to which they don't really see you and don't really know you and don't really know how to anticipate care for you. And those relationships, the reason that they get easily threatened is if something real intrudes and exposes the relationship, the fantasy basis of the relationship. It totally undoes everything, because you don't know what is and what isn't based on what is real for us, the symbolic meaning that we give. Now, if it were all so simple that you just had to hear that once and then you would immediately switch to representing yourself accurately, we would already be done. Have you noticed that process? Can you mentalize fast enough to see the meaning that you're making, and then catch the unfolding of your intention and action? Or because it happens so fast. In the second pillar of the meditation, of the Mettagroup method, we train you to mentalize fast so that you can watch this process unfold. And we teach emotional regulation that's meditation based. One of the reasons I think that that's a very effective method is because it bypasses the cognitive mind and goes into the perceptual database, the procedural database. So it remains online even if the cognitive mind falls away. What would be an adequate level of mentalizing? So you create the symbolic meaning for the present moment, and you know why you gave it that meaning, which means you have to be able to decode the memory thread that you used to define it. In the way that the brain works in terms of storing associated experiences with associated experiences, these long memory threads. And some of these threads are going to go all the way back to the very beginning. This collection of meanings that have been similarly coded. So in that creation of meaning in the present moment, you have what's actually happening in the present moment, plus the whole past experience that you've used to define it, plus the expectation of what's going to happen. All of that is how the experience of the present moment is. So it's not just the present moment, it's the past and the future all together in the present moment. Can you understand what that is? If you can understand what that is, and particularly the thing that you expect to happen, then the next piece, which is what you would like to express to other people about that. That's the expectation of what's going to happen. If you're conditioned to anticipate rejection, how are you going to authentically reveal yourself to someone else without protecting yourself from the rejection, right? That's the effect of the creation of reality. If your expectation is to be abandoned, then how do you create the expression to somebody else that doesn't include the protection from you being abandoned? If you think that you're going to be harmed by someone else and that you won't be able to detect when the harm is coming, how do you create a communication to someone else that isn't defended to the point that you are no longer in an authentic expression, but in an inauthentic expression to protect yourself? That you have to be able to mentalize fast enough and have the confidence of the relationship and the understanding of the commitment in the relationship that you can express yourself in a way that doesn't overexpose yourself or distort the authentic expression. The third aspect is you have to be able to understand that people understand you, right? Do you check to make sure that what you've communicated has been understood by the other person in the way that you meant it, so that when they respond to that, you can take in their response to what you actually said, and not that they misunderstood you and are responding to something else. Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where it doesn't seem like anybody's understanding each other? Kind of skewed perception. And then the fourth thing to mentalize fast enough is, how does understanding the exchange of communication that you just made alter or modify the terms of the relationship that you have? So secure relationships are dynamic. They're constantly changing. They're constantly being updated. And insecure relationships tend to be rigid. There isn't a lot of permission to modify the understanding. And disorganized relationships are intentionally vague in terms of what the agreements are, right? You're never really caught by an agreement that you've made because everything's implicit. Nothing is explicit. So the development of the mentalizing and emotional regulation in order to be able to hold those conversations in the Mettagroup method is done through a metta-vipassana practice. So one of the things that happens to children who grow up in insecure and disorganized family systems is there's a lot of negative experience that the child has to manage on their own. And so what we tend to do in those environments is create a working model of self that is lopsided onto the negative side, which is our anticipation of things going badly. And I think it's important to understand that when we create a working model of ourselves, we create it right from the beginning, right from the first interactions with the caregiver, based on their expression to us. And this is one of it's a little bit subtle, but not impossible to grasp. And important to really understand in the way that you regard yourself. A lot of us, in order to preserve the good parent, become the bad child, and we take on a lot of responsibility for the care going wrong. If we were just different, if we just behaved differently, if we just done something differently, if we just responded differently, if we didn't need so much, then we wouldn't have had the negative response that we had from our caregivers. And this is simply not true. But it is the way that we adapt to the family system. Our caregiver reflects back to us, and we build our understanding of who we are based on that reflection. Did you have a resourced caregiver who actually was curious about you, who attended to you, who empathetically connected to you, who was interested in what you were interested in what you seemed to be able to do well? Did they know all of that about you by observing you? And did they then reflect that picture of yourself back to you? So that when you went about creating the working model of yourself, it was actually a reflection of you that you were using to understand who you are. Is that making sense? In an insecure and disorganized household, what actually happens is the caregiver reflects back to them their experience of relating to you. And so what we're actually getting from them is a reflection of themselves, not a reflection of ourselves. And then we create a working model of ourselves, which is based on their experience of us, not based on who we are. Is that making sense? Then all of a sudden you can be too needy because they experience you as too needy. And they reflect back to you their experience of you being too needy, rather than reflecting back to you what it is that you needed, what it is that that moment might have been, and then meeting that need in such a way that you felt settled, so that you felt confident that you could express yourself spontaneously and authentically, and have the expectation that what would come back to you is what you needed. And in the reverse, what comes back to you is what they need from you. Is that making sense? And so we get orientated not in terms of ourselves, but in what we need to do for them. Making sense? And so this process of investigation, this process of becoming ourselves, is to then begin to examine this working model of ourselves and to understand whether it's actually us or them. And if it's them, to simply hand that back. We don't need to do much else with it. Just hand it back, because it's actually theirs. They can have it. And then begin to look at who we are. Now, there's some inherent issues that arise in this process. But the meditation piece is where we're really in there. In the Vipassana side, we're examining the nature of the realities that we create over and over again, pulling it apart. So the Vipassana approach, V means, of course, to divide, and Passana means to see clearly. You pull everything apart into the sense activations, and then you watch them come together in the reality that you created. So sensing experience into reality, based on the symbolic meaning that you give things, is the process of that kind of meditation approach. And it's really effective in seeing that process unfold. This is what I'm sensing. This is what I've made. This is what I'm sensing. This is what I've made. And the very early insights in Vipassana meditation is this is the sensing experience and this is the meaning. This is the sensing experience. This is the meaning that I'm giving to it. In that insight, of course, is that where the process of defining things, the process of giving meaning is what we're doing in each moment of the creation of reality. And then the exploration of emotion is, have you noticed that emotion is the thing that gives the oomph to the perception of what's real? And if there's an absence of emotion, it feels quite a bit less real, or quite a bit less compelling. So the sense of self is really internal visual thinking, internal auditory thinking, the felt sense of the physical body, and the emotion. That's what creates that experience of self. And the outside world, other people, is really more oriented toward external sight, external sound, the physical body, and then that oomph, I like to call it oomph, of emotion that makes everything believable. Of course, if you suppress emotion and you don't allow yourself that aspect, nothing really takes on a quality of real, nothing really takes on a quality of risk. Is that making sense so far? In understanding what secure functioning relationships are, which is the third pillar, and then being able to evaluate where you are in terms of developing relationships, you can then begin the process of organizing toward developing authentic relationships. I say authentic versus inauthentic. Sometimes, particularly in the beginning, one of the issues is that you think that to be authentic in a relationship, that means that you have to be fully disclosing. And I just want to reassure you that we don't mean that at all. In fact, we recommend that you do not do that. What it means is that the degree of intimacy is consensual, and that you have a mutual agreement that it's explicit about the level of disclosure that you make, and that you're free to limit the nature of the exchange based on those agreements, right? So consent is one of those things. Secure people tend to have a good sense of consent, good sensitivity to it, and feel quite free to license consent, right? And insecure people, and disorganized people in particular, well, insecure people don't have the sensitivity to consent, or they feel comfortable in overriding other people's consent. Or they don't feel a sense that that they're entitled to giving consent or withholding consent. Disorganized people, because they're mainly trampled in childhood, really don't think that consent is a real thing. Mostly their consent certainly never mattered, and their protestations never mattered. And so they don't really see how consent is possible. But it still is, and you have to learn it, and you have to be able to, the thing about boundaries is secure people understand that it's their boundary and that they have to maintain it. Insecure people make a boundary, and then they're astonished that the other person just doesn't keep it. I made a boundary and they just kept going through it. And you're thinking, yeah, but it's your boundary. You have to maintain it. You can't just hand your boundary off to someone else and expect them to maintain it. And disorganized people just acquiesce endlessly. And disappear. The only way that they can really maintain a boundary is by disappearing. But then, of course, you're alone all the time. We're not really meant to be alone. I know this might be astonishing, but we're actually, we are pack animals. We're the apex predator on this planet. We're pack animals. We're not herd animals. We're not passive. We're in that sense. And it's one of the reasons why we're prone toward patriarchy, because we're pack animals. And pack animals are meant to live in packs, in groups. We're meant to live in groups. In fact, the way our brain is structured is similar to all creatures on Earth that live in complex social groups, and we experience pain when we're separated from complex social groups. Loneliness, we experience loneliness and despair when we can't form relationships. This is our dilemma. I'm sure disorganized people would be quite happy to figure out a way to live entirely alone if they could. lot of auto-regulation, and some insecure people would prefer to find a way that they could live alone without being too unhappy about it. And that really is about the sadness of having so much difficulty in forming relationships and avoidance of that disappointment. In Western psychology, we often call that a failure to grieve. In the Mettagroup method, we call it the terrible sadness. And so the idea is to be able to begin the process of mourning, begin the process of processing the terrible sadness so that you can be with other people authentically. Part of it is a normalizing process where you actually tell people what's going on with you, only to discover, to your astonishment, that it's also going on with them. It's the human condition. We're all so very much alike, and at the same time completely unique, and that's one of the things that makes life interesting. So the development of mentalized and emotional regulation, combined with the psychoeducation on how relationships might function, and then also how you might reflect on what it is that's important to you, what you're good at, what's meaningful to you, and so that you can then begin to form the social relationships that you need in order to support your capacity to explore. And then the remapping of the attachment conditioning, which is done through the ideal parent figure protocol. This is the addition of the work that Dan Brown and his group did that actually changes the way that you create reality. When we simply rely on an education to understand how things might be, what we discover is we keep making the reality that's based on our conditioning recognize that we no longer want that reality, and then attempt to move into a different reality. But that process is really too slow in order to help us form the kind of dynamic relationships that we need in order to support the exploration path of our choosing. And what the ideal parent figure protocol does is remap the perceptual database so that in the moment of the creation of the symbolic meaning of the present moment, you can create a whole different meaning than what you are conditioned to create. And because you create a different meaning, as the action unfolds in anticipation to what might happen, the actions are completely different because the expectation is completely different. In the old method, of course, we have to see what the response is first before we can let the defense down. Whereas in the new way of creating reality, there's no need for the defense. And so you create instead a gesture that's connecting, a gesture that's open. And in that openness, fostering an exchange of what's real in the way that we can be real. Is that making sense? Why does that happen? The capacity to sense means that the object can be sensed. Consciousness arises, the body evaluates it for urgency, and then it's mapped to the perceptual database. And if you've done the visualization process and created these ideal outcomes, then, and you use that to make the symbolic meaning of the present moment, when it roars out into beingness, the expectation is different. And so the gesture reaching for the expectation is different, and it's automatic. That makes sense. Now, there you are, basing the construction of reality on these rickety visualizations that are complete fantasy. Yes, that's all true. When you do it, of course, there's an actual result that you gather, and then it's associated to the visualization. So the visualization becomes something that was entirely fantastical, but then has an associated actual outcome from the experience of creating reality. And then the more you do it, of course, the more actual experience is associated with the ideal outcome. And then it becomes something that's substantial rather than something that's simply these filaments of imagination. Now, this isn't different than the way that the process of creating reality has always been. If that mind moment gets to the top of the queue and it's compared to the perceptual database, and there's no symbolic meaning that you've already created that you can just stack on top of the present moment, then the imagination kicks in and creates meaning. And so the process of the mind has always been doing that. Every time you come into a novel situation, you create the associated meaning. The expectation of what happens is gathered from what actually happens and is remembered, and then is used for the future creation of those kinds of situations. Making sense? So in the Mettagroup method, what we really want to do is educate you into how secure relationships are supposed to function, how collaborative relationships are supposed to function, what the difference between primary exploration, which is that the activities that are really designed to create a sense of fulfillment and meaning in life, and the secondary explorations, which are meant for you to gather the time, energy, and resources so that you can pursue primary exploration, that you understand that cognitively, clearly, so that you actually can orient yourself to doing it. In the second pillar, you're developing the mentalizing to be able to process that fast enough so that you can navigate the world, that you have the emotional capacity for intense experience. Maxwell.
Hey, George, just curious in regards to primary and secondary exploration. Is it possible that, I mean, that one's secondary and primary exploration are aligned?
It's, I would say it's wonderful and better if they're aligned. And the unusual, awesome thing would be that they're the same.
Right. Yeah. I just ponder on that a lot when I'm like trying to figure out what to do next in life. As an anxious person, meaning holds a lot of weight for me.
Yeah.
So, but I also need to have time, energy, and resources, especially.
Right.
So just balancing those two things is a challenge. What I find myself doing is when I'm looking for secondary exploration, kind of linking it to like, this has to be where the meaning comes from as well.
Mm.
And lately, just starting to realize that maybe that's not the case. And for most people, it's probably a rare thing for someone.
In our economic system. Where
Exactly.
we're totally alienated, I guess, is the term from the means of production. We don't have a say in it. We just participate in it.
Yeah. So just kind of accepting that is difficult, but I also see like a source of my inability to move forward in my life is that need for them to be the same thing, and realizing that that's actually causing me a lot of suffering because the system we live in isn't really congruent with that for most people.
I think that the strategy is to figure out what it is that you're going to do for meaning, and figure out how much capacity you have for it on a daily basis, and then orient the day around that, and then find a secondary exploration that fits into that frame. That makes sense.
Yeah, for sure.
How many hours a day can you do primary exploration? 2 or 3 hours. Maybe if you're an astonishing person, 4 hours. Then you have the remaining 22 or 20 hours of the day to organize everything else, which can also include primary exploration. And then what part of the day is best for that exploration? How do you organize life in that way? Obviously, a lot of secondary exploration is not flexible in terms of what they demand from you. So then it's a kind of trying to work it out so that it fits well together.
I wish they had taught us this when we were young ones.
Yeah, the list of what I wish they taught us when we were young is long.
But that one for me, because being brought up in the U.S., the meaning I made out of the messages I was getting from my parents, teachers, is that your secondary exploration is the primary.
Right.
It is the most important thing. And just 35 years of that being ingrained is now needing to be untangled. It's not fun, but
and it wasn't accidental actually when you look at the development of
yeah.
that. The whole public education was shifted after the Second World War into supporting that particular point of view, where before that it would have been something that was organized more in terms of meaning, but also in the way that the unequal distribution of resources is in our culture, and it's at an astonishing level now. Most people don't have resources enough to do primary exploration, and it's not considered important. The statistic that I like is 50% of Nobel Prizes go to people that are born in the top 5% of the economic distribution. The remaining 50% of Nobel Prizes are awarded to people in the next 6% of the economic distribution, which means we've made a decision culturally that people are born in the bottom 89% of the economic distribution aren't resourced enough that they can develop their capacities to participate in that level of discourse, which I think is, I call it the great squandering. Stephen Jay Gould, who was an interesting guy, a researcher, said the next Einstein is more likely to be parking your car as a valet than he is to be in a lab exploring physics because of this distribution. And we can easily identify with that and not understand that again is them, and that's been imposed on us. But it also brings up one of the hardest things about all of this is that you begin to understand that those limitations which were imposed on us have had a restrictive effect, right? So that if you had those resources and that expansive capacity to explore opened up from the very beginning, it's vastly different than you recognize that and you begin now, and your exploration is moving here, right? Beginning to open up. And if we're unwilling to really touch into the terrible sadness of how those restrictions have affected us, we simply will avoid the explorations that bring it up. You're beginning to explore now and you're attempting to go for it, and suddenly there's a spike of this terrible sadness at how the limits that were imposed on you are limiting this. Then if you turn away from that, of course, you curtail the exploration, and we have to be able to push into it so that we can continue to open that exploration. And still, the people that had that from the beginning will be beyond where we can get to. We really have to come to a place where we're cool with it so that we can get on with what's possible for us, which will be enough. So anyway, I think that one of the things that I think is the most interesting about the Mettagroup method is that we really are using the self as constructed in the Eastern meditative point of view rather than in the Western psychological point of view. And that we're using meditation as a means of exploring that process of the creation of self and world in that Eastern meditative model, and rather than in the psychoanalytic or psychotherapy model, which I actually have a hard time relating to. But if we looked at that, of course, we have the Freudian model that sort of evolved into the kind of Kleinian modeling that's quite dominant still. And then we have the Bowlby attachment model. So pulling the Bowlby attachment model and integrating it with the Eastern model of self seems without contradiction. In some sense, Bowlby and Ainsworth are the materialist. It's what actually happens to you that creates this experience that we're having. I also, and I think that this is also one of the main differences, is really experience a sense of something beyond simply the material, right? There is this spiritual dimension to the experience of life, which I think is important to be able to explore. And the absence of that, which is also very common in Western psychological approaches, is a real deficit for me. I do have a sense beyond the simple not knowing, right? The void of Theravada, the void of Hinayana practice, which is simply, it's unknowable. Moving into this sense of sacredness that comes from the Mahayana practices, even with all of the problems of culture that come from, say, the Zen practice or the Tibetan practices, the culture-bound nature of that, but that sense of sacredness that comes from practice, which still is unknowable in a way, but seems quite important in terms of finding meaning in life, which is largely absent from the Western psychological approach, which is really to help you integrate into what I would call secondary exploration and be content with a lack of meaning that isn't really afforded to the majority of our citizens in the system that we've created. Is that making sense? So you go beyond, you do the initial attachment work to repair your capacity to form supportive relationships. You repair your capacity to explore deeply, and then you turn that on the things that are likely to provide meaning for you. Anyway, that's our thought process around why we practice in the way we do. What do you say we do just a quick piece of practice since we've rambled on? Really, I say we, but I mean mainly me. What would you like to practice? Loving kindness, maybe? That's what it's feeling like. Okay. And we're just going to do loving kindness for self. How's that? So go ahead and settle in. Okay, let go of the meditation. How's that? Good? Good. It?
Hey, George, the all the objects arising in the see here feel, um, there's no view for them, right? It's just distractions.
No, the thing about holding the view is you're recognizing through the view the arising of everything and paying attention to the distortion that the view causes in your experiencing of the arising and passing of things. In an equanimous mind, they appear in one way. In an angry mind, they appear one way. In a holding the view of love and kindness, they appear differently. And so what you're wanting to be able to do is perceive moment by moment whether or not the mind is presenting an equanimous, sort of straight, undistorted view, or in what way the mind is distorting the experience.
Through looking at the internal
Yeah.
objects.
Well, you can do it with external objects too. So, for some reason,
I was looking at this.
Mhm.
I was looking at the sense of self as a different object and the see here feel as a different objects.
Right. So see, hear, feel are the threads, and then the sense of self is the tapestry that weaves together from the different threads. And then how do you view the self? Is the self a lovely thing no matter what it does? Is the self, are you critical of the sense of self? Is some aspects of self okay and some not okay? All of that. But you know, appearance is related to view, and it can be wildly different. What I like to do is experience the same thing. You know, the appearance of the room differently depending on how the view is. So I was thinking, just because I've been traveling, at the beginning of the day, I was totally fine with the chaos and the movement and all the different people and all the stuff. But having traveled for 20 hours, by the end of the day, it was really jarring, everything. And that just has to do with my capacity in that moment, right? Even the sound was a problem for me at the end of the day, whereas at the beginning of the day, I didn't even consider it. And that's happening all the time with everything. Can you attend to that so that you don't create a sense of reality that is just distorted, that then leads to an unfortunate response to the conditions?
Thank you.
Everybody's okay? Good. Thank you. I offer the teaching freely, but if you are resourced and can make a donation, it's really appreciated. It helps support me and also the work Mettagroup is doing. There's a link on the website to do that. Really appreciate your practice. I hope to see you soon. Bye.